get back into our regular readings in the Gospel of Luke, and we're in chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbiter over you?" And then he said to the crowd, "Take care, be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Then he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and then there I will store all my grain and all my goods. Then I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, enjoy.' But God said to him, 'Mindless one, this night your soul is required of you. And the things that you prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. I remember years ago seeing a documentary that was called Affluenza. And of course it's parody off of influenza, being a disease. And so affluenza was a disease in the so-called first world of wanting to be affluent all the time. And it was a sickness. You just keep wanting more and more and more. The reason I thought of that is because while John was home for the holidays, we watched a documentary that he had seen at his church on caring for creation. And it had all sorts of things it dealt with, but at least one of the things was similar to that previous documentary. It mentioned that when we act as consumers, that generally we have this prevailing belief that more is better. For example, the more things I own, the happier and more successful I'll be in life. The more I eat, the more pleasant it will be. This indeed is the dominant narrative, at least in the wealthier countries. But then I thought, well, it's not just wealthier countries, because I've heard people say things like, "I don't have much of a life because I don't own many things." And so there's still that belief, even though they don't have a lot of things, they still think their life is based on having many things. And yet Jesus specifically says here that a man's life is not in the abundance of the things from his possessions. The life that God gives us is so much greater and deeper than just what we have or what we do not have. That's what our text, I think, is lifting up for us. As a man approaches Jesus from the crowd, he has a request. "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, typically, when a father died, the oldest son was given charge of dividing that inheritance up. He would get a double portion, because if there was the mother still at home, or if there was any unwed daughters at home, he needed the extra portion to be able to help take care of them. And then every other son, no matter how many there were, would just get an equal portion on down. So for whatever reason, this oldest brother has not given this one who comes in request of Jesus the proper inheritance. That would seem to be a legitimate need of his, and yet Jesus says, "Who established me as judge or divider over you?" It's almost as if he's saying that he didn't come just to deal with fixing things here and now with smaller problems. His fixing, if we want to use that word, was to bring an eternal life, which is much greater than the life that we have now. We could say that he's not coming to the world to make minor fixes on things here and now, but he's coming to give us a greater life. So that's why I think he responded to the man the way he did. And then he turns to the crowd and he says, "Watch, guard yourselves from all covetousness." We don't use the word covetousness now, but greediness or avarice, that desire for more and more and more. That's what he's talking about. Guard yourself from that. And then he adds that phrase that we've already said, our lives do not consist in the abundance of things from our possessions. To emphasize that point, he tells a parable. Within the parable, a man's field yields its best crop ever. The man has a problem. It's not a bad problem, but his storage room, they didn't really have barns, I know the translation said that, but they would have these storage rooms that they would build to store the grain and other things in, wine and other produce. His storage rooms weren't big enough because the yield was so good that it would overflow and there wasn't enough room. So he's thinking, what am I going to do? And he comes up with a solution. I'm going to tear down my storage rooms, and then I'm going to build bigger ones. I will gather there all the wheat and all my good things. And then what? Well, then he thinks to himself, I'll relax. You have much good laid up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, enjoy. And yet, in the parable, this man is called a mindless one. Because it turns out he's going to die that very night. And the question is, these things which you've prepared, whose will they be? And the answer seems to be not yours. You're going to be dead. So how are you going to enjoy these bigger storage rooms and all of that harvest for yourself? You're going to be gone. So Jesus adds, is the one who stores up for himself and is not rich unto God. So that man believed in the parable, I think the way we do in the world around us, that life consists in the abundance of our possessions or goods. And yet he's mindless, as Jesus says in the parable, because he could say to himself, you know, I've always been able to live off of what my storage rooms, my present ones, do hold. Maybe I can use this extra to help those in need. But instead of thinking of that way, the only thing that he can do is think of himself. I won't have to work for years. So if I have these bigger storage rooms that hold all of that, I can just sit back without any working anymore. Abundant possessions aren't given to us to determine our life for future years, to just have extra, but they're given to us to share with others that are in need. See how what Jesus says is so counter to what the world around us is always saying, more is better. The more things I have or can buy, the happier I will be. That was the attitude of the mindless man in the parable. Life, being rich unto God, as Jesus calls it, has very little to do with how much we have or do not have. Let's hear how Betty Everley experienced this. Betty's issue wasn't having too many things and using them all on herself, but it was believing that she didn't have much of a life because she didn't have many things at a certain time in her life. God had to remind her that her life didn't consist of either what she had or what she didn't have. In this time of her life, she said, Betty at first thought it was the worst summer of my life. I was almost 40. I'd been divorced 7 years. I was the single mother of 2. I had a secretary's job that paid too little and a stack of monthly bills that kept getting taller. At the start of the summer, the child support checks that her ex-husband sent her stopped coming. She called and asked what was wrong, and he said, I don't know. My company is still taking them automatically out of the amount out of my check, so it's not a problem with me. And she tried to making other calls, but nothing seemed to be working very quickly. So one morning, Betty told her 2 children, and they were eating leftover cold pizza, things will be a little tough for a while. Why, Mom? They asked. She decided to be honest. Well, money is really, really tight. We have to save as much as we can till I get my next paycheck. Well, that sounded possible until 2 days later, as she was driving the kids to school before she went to work, her car engine started making loud knocking noises, and then the oil light came on. She pulled into a convenience store. She checked the oil level. It was 3 quarts low. She knew it shouldn't be that low, but nothing else was open. She went into the convenience store. It cost a little more money for oil there, but she spent the money on the 3 quarts, put them in. She got the kids to school, and then she was starting to head to her own work. By the time she was driving into the parking lot, the oil light came on again. So when she parked her car, she looked at the oil level. Most of the 3 quarts was already gone. Then she saw there was an oil strike going from her car through the parking lot out onto the road. There was a large tow truck bill. Then the mechanic said it's going to cost $500 to fix the leak. A co-worker said that she would drive her to pick up the kids after school and also to take her home, and said she didn't mind doing that for the rest of the week. Betty had grown up thinking, though, self-sufficiency. We should be able to take care of ourselves, and we acquire things, and so that's how we can be self-sufficient. And yet she knew now she needed to ask for help. And yet she felt like a failure because she asked for help, because she still believed her life consisted in the number of her possessions. Yet she called her pastor in the morning, and he tried to reassure her, this is why we have a benevolence fund. He said, you'll get a check in a couple of days, and it'll pay for the car repairs, and also there'll be some left over to help with some of the utility bills. God had indeed answered my prayers, she thought. All I have to do is make it through this weekend. But I have no transportation, and there's very little food in the house. Well, Saturday morning, as she woke up and she looked outside, she saw there was something on the porch. 2 grocery bags full of food. Bread, fruits, vegetables, cereal, pasta, tuna, peanut butter, and others. Betty said that reminded her to trust God's faithfulness. She remembered a story in the Old Testament in 1 Kings 17 about a widow that Elijah was staying with, and there was a famine in the land. She had very little food, and yet God did not allow that food to be completely gone during the whole time of that famine. So she was reminded that God would always be faithful and take care of her. Eventually, she said the child support issue was resolved. It turned out an employee at the place where her ex-husband worked had been embezzling funds. So they had taken money out of the ex-husband's paycheck, but this person was stealing that money, and so it wasn't able to get to Betty. But she said, but if I had not experienced this clog in my financial pipeline, or my car breaking down, I might not have received the blessings from generous people. The blessings of knowing that her life was so much more than just what we might have or not have at any moment. Our world does live in a mindless state. More is better. The more things I have, the happier I'll be. And even if we don't have many things, we still tend to believe it. Yet Jesus says that our lives do not consist in the abundance of things from our possessions. The life God is giving us is so much deeper than merely what we have or do not have. So may we not be mindless ones, centering our possessions around ourselves. Instead, may we use any abundance of possessions to show others in need how generous God is to us all. The life Jesus gives each one of us is greater than all the possessions in the